Thank you very much. I agreed right away, honored and flattered to give this talk without the slightest sense of knowing how the conference would be framed. I did so because of my great admiration for the cultural production program, for its engaged students and its generous faculty supporters. I do confess, though, as Mark noted, that I have been provoked to a certain combativeness myself by the conference title and imagery, which is ironic that for a peaceful brethren like myself, that I was, pushed in that way. And it happened in this way. It was while hanging in this brilliant poster on my office door that I was compelled to reflect somewhat uneasily on how I might contribute to a conversation that seemed intent on foregrounding conflict. You see, as a rule, I don't wear a camo. And I try to avoid employing violent imagery, even at the level of metaphor, which can be quite a challenge, considering that vernacular speech is so filled with phrases about killing this or being slain by that, cutting through something, exploding something else. We've heard all these things already. And actually, I have to tip my hat to Kevin Driscoll over here, because a sort of key moment in my exercising a certain vigilance around the words that I use happened this fall, shortly after I started Twittering, and I went to a Cesaria Devora concert downtown. He was a beautiful Cape Verdean singer. And she was there, and so was Madeline Peyroux, two vocalists who I really admire, and I was very glad to see. And after the concert, I tweeted that Cesaria killed it, because I just thought she did. I was slain. I was in the audience, and I was just, really taken aback by her performance, just so brought into that moment. And Kevin tweeted something back that was along the lines of, killed is so 2008, we need to upgrade our vocabulary for 2009. And it was a joke, but it did make me think twice, because I do think a lot about language, and carefully about language. And that's part of what I want to kind of focus on in my remarks to you today. Because I was struck by what seemed like a profound disconnect between, on the one hand, the conference title, Culture Combat, and the suggestive image of, and the designer can take issue with my interpretation, but what seemed like it could be easily enough read as an exploding, bleeding city. And on the other, the more sensitive terminology used to explicate these things in the subtitle, Provoking the Social Imaginary, and in the call for submissions. Whether or not it was intentional, the title and poster succeeded in provoking me to compose some remarks which directly address the question of how we might frame our fields of cultural production and interpret and represent the social imaginary in ways that not only resist but undermine the pervasive, ever-creeping language and culture of violence. When one says, pick your battles, as I settled on for a title for this, one is usually offering advice with regard to the worthy expenditure of one's energy and time. But one acknowledges, too, that life is full of possible points of combat, power being the site of common contact, often tellingly in asymmetrical situations. Indeed, the phrase could be heard as a cynical expression, pick your battles, a shrug calling attention to the futility of fighting in such a Sisyphean system, one battle lying beyond the next. In other words, where on earth would one begin? But one can also employ the phrase as a genuine bit of practical strategy, and that's the way I use it here. The fight I pick is with the very terms of engagement we use, and by we, I mean both academics and artists, and it's wonderful that we're all here today, and those of us who like to inhabit some space between the two. The very terms we use to imagine, represent, and give sensual form to the social imaginary, as the conference title, in a less confrontational way, also puts it. How does the language we use to describe cultural practice, in turn, inform the shapes our cultural productions take? In perceiving combat all around us, culture as constituted by combat, never mind nature, what do we overlook? What do we miss out on? Do we miss the real fight we should be having, one that contests the ways we are embattled as cultural producers? Do we play into the hands of those all too eager to promote Manichaean culture wars and clashes of civilization? If fight we must, would it not be more effective at any rate to embrace, as the cliche would have it, a form of jiu-jitsu. I don't, for instance, think we should take desensitization as a foregone conclusion. To do so will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Plus, moreover, let's face it, we're privileged to live in the overdeveloped world, the part of the world that exports shock and awe in order to safely consume it at a distance, a place in which we are generally free of the threat of injury or injustice that pervades the developmentally arrested world. For us, the main source of shock and awe is the nightly news, who don't, we must remember, really ever show us the atrocities or costs of war, so as to truly bring home the horrors of our adventures abroad. From my own vantage as a scholar and cultural producer, that is from a musical standpoint, what does it mean to speak of culture combat in the form of contested soundscapes? Something that I do think about, at a moment in time when music is actually being used in combat as an instrument of torture. Do we not risk trivializing the true tragedies of war by projecting violence more figuratively across the discursive landscape? It's a vexing question. I'm reminded immediately of the Jamaican musical institution called the Sound Clash, a practice emerging from a spirited entrepreneurial context and competitive urban culture. Rival sound systems since the 1950s have lined up side by side to battle over status and for the fruits of audience patronage. This culture gave rise to an arms race in speaker technology and musical innovation alike. Custom cabinets commissioned and built, studios and turntables repurposed as instruments in themselves, and the rhetoric of sonic and economic competition ratcheted up to the level of Hollywood hyperbole. Legendary soundman Duke Reed, for instance, was known for wearing a pair of pistols on his hips, in part because metaphorical violence sometimes spilled over into actual violence. And by the late 1970s, a Wild West spirit so infused the dance hall scene that one could hear Josie Wales square off against Clint Eastwood. A creeping bit of kitsch, keeping things cartoonish enough to offer a non-literal interpretation of gun talk, even as Jamaican society was becoming increasingly militarized, readied for the Reagan years, for flexible accumulation, for structural adjustments imposed by the IMF. Against this backdrop, it's important to note that reggae and its spiritual and intellectual guide, Rastafari, long ago turned from politics qua politics, that is, the mobilization of people in a democratic organization of power and physical resources, to the politics of culture, to the mobilization of symbols to communicate and organize outside of political institutions, in part as a critique of and a response to pre-existing disenfranchisement. This cultural politics, for all its power, remains an ambiguous resource. Although the quote-unquote cultural turn of reggae and Rastafari may have succeeded in, as Barry Shabans argues, exercising the ideology of racism in Jamaica, at the same time, although they may no longer subscribe to Eurocentric hierarchies of value, the black masses of Jamaica remain by and large impoverished, disenfranchised, and terrorized by an everyday urban violence that, in local terms, is often referred to as war, just as certain parts of Kingston become rebranded as Basra, Tel Aviv, Afghanistan.